Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Yeah.
Today, we're going to be looking at something that's pretty important for all of us Aussies.
Right.
It's the government's proposed election reforms.
Mm-hmm.
And judging from the stack of articles and notes that you've all sent in,
Right.
it seems like you guys are particularly worried about the potential downsides of these changes and whether they could actually make things worse.
Yeah.
And you're definitely not alone in that feeling.
No, not at all.
These reforms are causing a bit of a stir.
They really are.
And a lot of people are raising some serious concerns.
Absolutely.
Luckily, we've got an expert speaker here
Huh.
to help us break it all down.
It's definitely a hot button topic, and with good reason, too.
Yeah.
The proposed changes are complex with a lot of moving parts, and it's easy to get lost in the details.
Okay, so let's start with the basics.
Oh,
What's the
yes.
government's stated goal with these reforms?
Right.
What are they actually trying to achieve?
So, on the surface,
Yeah.
the aim is to reduce the influence of big money in elections.
Okay.
It sounds pretty good in theory, right?
It does, yeah.
They're talking about introducing things like donation caps, spending limits,
Right.
and more transparency in campaign financing.
Ah.
Who wouldn't want a cleaner political
Yeah.
system?
Less money sloshing around,
Yeah.
less chance for corruption.
Exactly.
It all sounds very noble.
Yeah,
But I get the feeling there's more to this story.
there is.
You've flagged some pretty serious potential issues with how these reforms are actually being designed.
Exactly. You know what they say.
Yeah.
The devil's in the details. While reducing the influence of big money is definitely a worthwhile goal,
Yeah.
the proposed legislation has some major flaws
Okay.
that could actually end up hurting smaller parties and independent candidates.
Okay.
It might even make the system less transparent,
Right.
not more.
Yeah.
And there are concerns that it could even clash with the Australian Constitution.
Whoa. Okay. Those are some heavy accusations.
Yeah, they are.
Let's break those down one by one.
Sure.
You mentioned smaller parties and independents getting squeezed.
Yes.
How would that happen?
Well, one of the biggest red flags is the proposed boost to public funding for political parties.
Right.
The plan is to increase the per-vote funding from $3 to $5.
Okay.
Now, that might seem like small change,
Yeah.
but when you consider that this applies to every single vote cast
Right.
in both the House of Representatives and the Senate elections,
Uh-huh.
it amounts to a massive injection of cash into the system.
Yeah.
We're talking an extra $41 million
Wow.
per election cycle.
$41 million.
Yeah,
That's a serious chunk of change.
it is.
I'm guessing that money isn't going to be distributed equally
You guessed it.
amongst every single party and independent out there.
No. Analysis by the Australia Institute indicates that around 3/4 of this extra funding,
Right.
roughly $32 million,
Okay.
would go directly to the major parties, Labor and the Liberals, and
Well-
to add fuel to the fire.
Oh, no.
They're also proposing a new administrative funding allowance
What's that?
of $90,000
Yeah.
per House representative and $45,000 per senator
Oh.
per election cycle.
So essentially,
Yeah.
these reforms are handing the major parties a gigantic financial advantage,
Basically.
making it even harder for smaller parties and independents to even get a foot in the door.
It's a big concern.
Yeah.
It creates a system where the established players have a huge head start,
Right.
making it extremely difficult for new voices and alternative perspectives to gain any traction.
Yeah.
And for voters,
Yeah.
this means potentially fewer choices and a less diverse political landscape.
That's not exactly a recipe for a thriving democracy.
No, it's not.
It almost sounds like a
Okay.
self-serving system designed to protect the status quo.
Pretty much.
What about the donation caps?
Right?
They're proposing a limit of $20,000 per year,
Uh-huh.
which, again,
Yeah.
sounds reasonable on paper.
It does until you look a little closer.
Okay.
Remember,
Yeah.
this cap applies per calendar year,
Right.
and it resets during election years.
Oh, okay.
So realistically, someone could donate $40,000 in an election year.
Right, right.
And that's not the only loophole.
Oh, no.
This cap only applies to donations to a single party or candidate.
Right.
However,
Yeah.
major parties like Labor and the Liberals
Mm-hmm.
have multiple registered parties at the state and territory level.
Hold on. Are you saying a donor could just give $20,000
Yep.
to each of these state and territory branches,
They could.
essentially bypassing the whole point of the cap?
Exactly. It's not hard to see how a wealthy individual or
Yeah.
corporation could still funnel huge amounts of money into the coffers of the major parties.
So much for a level playing field. And, one of the notes he sent me
Yes.
included a rather cynical quote about potentially splitting the Liberal National Party in Queensland to
Ah.
create even more avenues for donations.
Yeah, that's a pretty telling example of how the proposed donation cap,
Right.
riddled with loopholes as it is,
Yeah.
could easily be manipulated. It makes you wonder how effective it would actually be in achieving its stated goal.
It's starting to sound like a bit of a smoke and mirror show, honestly.
Little bit, yeah.
These reforms are being presented as a way to level the playing field.
Mm-hmm.
But so far,
Yeah,
all I'm seeing is more advantages for those who are already in power.
that's a big concern.
And then there's the issue of these so-called nominated entities,
Ah, yes.
which add another layer of complexity and potential for abuse.
Exactly.
Nominated entities.
Yeah.
That sounds pretty vague and ominous.
It does, doesn't it?
What exactly are we talking about here?
These are essentially party-affiliated organizations
Okay.
that are exempt from the donation caps.
Okay.
They can hold assets and receive unlimited funding,
Wow.
and there's very little transparency around their operation.
So potentially a black hole for political donations.
It's possible.
Allowing wealthy individuals and corporations to exert influence without any real accountability or public scrutiny.
That's the concern, and we've already seen similar entities cause problems in Victoria.
Really?
They've been used to channel large sums of money to major parties,
Oh, wow.
completely bypassing the donation caps that apply to everyone else.
Right.
There's even a constitutional challenge underway in Victoria. It's
Yeah.
arguing that these entities infringe on political communication rights.
This is all getting a bit worrying.
It is, yeah.
We've got these huge boosts to public funding that mainly benefit the major parties, donation caps that are full of holes,
Yes.
and now these shadowy nominated entities lurking in the background.
Right.
What happened to transparency and fairness?
It's a valid question.
It really is.
And we haven't even touched on the proposed spending caps yet.
Oh, right.
They also seem to be riddled with loopholes and exemptions.
Oh, boy.
Plus, there's a glaring omission in the entire reform package. That really makes you wonder about the government's true intentions.
What's that?
The complete lack of truth in political advertising laws.
Wait, no truth in advertising?
Yeah.
Seriously?
Yeah, seriously.
We can dive into that after we take a moment to let all of this sink in.
Definitely.
This is already a lot to process.
It is. All right, so let's dig into these spending caps.
Okay.
On the surface, they appear fairly reasonable.
Uh-huh.
A $90 million limit for national spending and an $800,000 cap per electorate.
Sounds straightforward enough.
Yeah.
But knowing what we know now about these reforms,
Yeah.
I have a feeling
You're probably right.
you're about to reveal some hidden complexities.
You're catching on quickly. It's like a game where the rules seem fair,
Yeah.
but then you realize some players have special privileges. For example,
Yeah.
generic party advertising is completely exempt from the per-seat spending cap.
Oh, really?
This means a party can flood an electorate with ads
Right.
that simply say, vote Labor or vote Liberal. Right.
Without it counting towards their limit.
So an independent candidate who's already at a disadvantage
Yeah.
has to be incredibly careful about every dollar they spend,
Absolute.
while the major parties can basically spend freely on generic advertising.
Precisely.
Wow.
And it gets worse.
Oh, no.
Ministerial promotions are also excluded from a candidate's electorate spending limit.
Seriously.
So if you're a sitting MP who also happens to be a government minister,
Right.
you can essentially use taxpayer-funded activities to promote yourself
Wow.
without it impacting your campaign budget.
It's starting to feel like a system designed to protect incumbents at all costs.
It does a bit, doesn't it?
And what about the advantages that incumbent MPs already have?
Right.
Like name recognition, access to resources,
Hmm.
and the ability to make announcements that benefit their electorate.
All excellent points.
Yeah.
These inherent advantages of incumbency are completely ignored in the proposed reforms.
Wow.
A challenger has to work so much harder and spend significantly more.
Yeah. Just to reach the same level of visibility as a sitting MP.
Yeah.
These spending caps, with their various loopholes and omissions,
Yeah.
do very little to create a truly level playing field.
This is all incredibly disheartening.
Yeah.
It's like we're being sold a shiny new car,
Right.
but underneath the hood,
Yeah.
it's the same old engine,
Exactly.
just with a fresh coat of paint.
And to top it all off,
Right.
you mentioned there's no provision for truth in political advertising.
Yeah, that's right.
Despite all the talk about cleaning up politics and reducing the influence of money, the government has chosen not to include any measures to ensure truthfulness in campaign advertising.
So this means that In theory,
Yeah.
taxpayer money could be used to fund campaigns filled with misleading or outright false information.
It's possible,
So we
unfortunately.
could end up with a situation where the major parties,
Yeah,
already swimming in public funding,
exactly.
are able to bombard voters with deceptive ads,
Right.
while smaller parties and independents struggle to be heard.
That's the concern.
Sounds like a recipe for voter cynicism and distrust.
And we have real-world examples of how damaging this can be.
Oh, really?
Remember the Metascare campaign during the 2016 federal election?
Oh, yeah.
That was a blatant attempt to mislead voters with false claims about healthcare policy.
That was a disgraceful episode in Australian politics.
It was.
And without any safeguards in place,
Yeah.
we're leaving the door wide open for similar tactics.
Exactly.
Potentially even more sophisticated and insidious,
Right.
especially with the added boost of increased public funding.
Absolutely. It's a dangerous path to go down.
It really is.
And it's not just about fairness between parties.
Right.
It's about protecting the integrity of our democracy.
Uh-huh.
If we can't trust the information being presented to us during elections, how can we make informed decisions about who to vote for?
You've raised a crucial point.
Thank you.
Accurate information is the foundation of a healthy democracy.
It really is.
Without it,
Yeah,
we're essentially flying blind.
absolutely.
It's all starting to feel pretty bleak, to be honest.
Yeah.
But before we descend into complete despair,
Okay.
you did mention there were a couple of positive aspects to these reforms.
Yes. There are a couple of glimmers of hope.
Okay, good.
For one,
Yeah.
they're proposing to lower the donation disclosure threshold from $14,500 to $1,000.
Okay.
This means that any donation above $1,000 would have to be publicly disclosed,
Right.
which would theoretically allow for greater transparency and scrutiny of political funding.
More transparency is always a good thing.
Absolutely.
At least it allows for greater accountability.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they're also suggesting the introduction of real-time disclosure,
What's that?
meaning donations would have to be reported as they are received
Okay.
rather than months or even years later.
So voters would be able to see in real time who is donating to whom and
Yes.
how much.
That's right.
That seems like a step in the right direction.
It is.
Yeah.
But the question is whether these positive changes are enough to outweigh the potential downsides of the reforms as a whole.
That's like trying to patch up a sinking ship with a bit of duct tape.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
You might slow down the leak, but it's not a permanent solution.
Right.
And, one thing that really worries me
Mm-hmm.
is the lack of discussion around the constitutional implications of these reforms.
That's a huge concern.
It is.
Leading constitutional law experts,
Yeah.
like Professor Antumi,
Right?
have raised serious concerns about the high donation caps and the preferential treatment given to incumbents.
Wow.
They argue that these provisions could actually violate the implied freedom of political communication,
Right.
which is enshrined in the Australian Constitution.
Now, for those of us who aren't constitutional law experts, can
Yeah.
you explain what the implied freedom of political communication actually means
Sure.
and why it matters in this context?
It's a fundamental principle that underpins our democracy. Essentially, it means that citizens have a right to freely communicate about political matters without undue restrictions from the government.
Right.
This right is not explicitly stated in the Constitution,
Okay.
but the High Court has recognized it as an essential part of our democratic system.
So how did these reforms potentially infringe on this right?
Professor Toomey argues that the high donation caps,
Right.
combined with the advantages given to incumbents,
Yeah.
could effectively silence dissenting voices
Really?
and limit the ability of challengers to effectively communicate their message.
That's not good.
It creates an uneven playing field that undermines fair and open political debate.
So we could end up with a situation where these reforms,
Right.
which are supposed to be about making our elections fairer,
Exactly.
are actually struck down by the High Court
It's possible.
because they violate our fundamental rights.
That would be ironic, wouldn't it?
That's incredibly ironic.
Yeah,
Not to mention a massive waste of time and taxpayer money.
it would be. It's a real possibility.
Yeah.
And it underscores the need for a much more careful and considered approach to electoral reform. We need to ensure that any changes we make are not only effective in achieving their stated goals,
Right.
but also consistent with our Constitution
Yeah.
and the principles of a free and fair democracy.
We can't just rush through complex legislation like this without proper scrutiny and debate.
No, we can't.
And it seems like that's exactly what the government is trying to do.
The rushed process has been alarming, to say the least.
Really?
There's been very little time for detailed analysis,
Right.
public consultation, or consideration of amendments.
Wow.
It's almost as if they're trying to avoid proper scrutiny.
Which, of course, makes you
Oh.
wonder what they're trying to hide.
Exactly.
It's all incredibly frustrating.
It is.
Especially when you consider how important these reforms are for the future of our democracy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
These changes have the potential to shape Australian politics for years to come.
It's not something to be taken lightly.
It's not.
So
Yeah.
what can we, as concerned citizens, do about this?
Right.
Is there any hope of getting these reforms back on track?
The first step is to make our voices heard.
Okay.
Contact your local MP, engage in public debate,
Right.
and demand a more transparent and accountable process.
That's a good start.
It is.
But beyond raising awareness,
Yes.
what would a more responsible and effective approach to electoral reform look like?
Well, I think we need to shift our focus away from quick fixes and Band-Aid solutions.
Right.
We need to take a long, hard look at the underlying principles of our electoral system
Okay.
and ask ourselves some fundamental questions.
It sounds like we need to hit the reset button and really think about what kind of electoral system we want for Australia.
Absolutely.
What are the core values we should be prioritizing?
We need to ask ourselves, what does a truly fair and representative democracy look like?
Yeah.
How do we ensure that all voices are heard, not just those with the deepest pockets? And how do we restore public trust in our political system?
Yeah.
These are big questions,
They are.
and they deserve a much deeper and a more nuanced discussion than what we've seen so far.
Well said. But let's get a bit more concrete.
Okay.
If you were in charge of redesigning these reforms,
Right.
where would you even begin?
First, I'd scrap this rushed timeline and commit to a comprehensive and transparent process.
Okay.
We need genuine consultation with experts, stakeholders,
Right.
and most importantly, the Australian people.
You know what?
Yeah.
You just reminded me.
Oh.
Remember that Senate inquiry on electoral reform that happened last year?
Yeah,
They made a whole bunch of thoughtful recommendations
they did.
that seem to have been largely ignored in the current legislation.
Seems that way, yeah.
You're right. I'd completely forgotten about that inquiry.
Yeah.
Maybe it's time to dust off those recommendations.
Yeah, absolutely.
And see what valuable insights we can glean from them.
Exactly. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. Let's learn from the work that's already been done.
Yeah.
And when it comes to the specifics of the reforms,
Yeah.
I think we need to go back to the drawing board on several key areas.
Like those gaping loopholes in the donation and spending caps.
Definitely. If we're serious about reducing the influence of big money,
Yeah.
we need to set much stricter limits.
Yuck.
Imagine a donation cap of, say, $5,000 per donor per year.
Why?
And that cap should apply to all donations made to a party,
Right.
including its state and territory branches.
Okay.
So there's no way to game the system.
A $5,000 cap would certainly send a strong message
They would.
that big money doesn't rule the roost.
Exactly.
But what about public funding?
Right.
How can we make sure that smaller parties and independents aren't left behind
Okay.
in a system dominated by the major parties?
Instead of just handing out more cash to the major parties,
Yeah.
we could explore alternative models of public funding. Maybe a system where a portion of the funding is based on the number of votes received in the previous election,
Okay.
but with the higher weighting for smaller parties and independents.
Right. So essentially reward parties that are actually gaining traction with voters
Exactly.
rather than just those that already hold a majority of the seats.
That's the idea.
It makes sense to me.
Good.
And what about those shadowy nominated entities?
Yeah.
How do we deal with them?
Transparency is key here.
Okay.
We need much stricter guidelines and reporting requirements for these entities.
Right.
Their purpose and operations should be clearly defined, and their financial activities should be subject to rigorous public scrutiny.
Sunlight is the best disinfectant, as they say.
It is.
Shining a light on these entities might discourage some of the shadier practices.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Or we could go even further and consider abolishing them altogether.
Really?
Some experts have argued that this would be the simplest and most effective way to prevent them from being used as a loophole to funnel unlimited funds into the political system.
Okay, so lower donation caps,
Mm-hmm.
a fairer system of public funding,
Yeah.
and greater transparency around,
Right.
or even abolishing
Yeah.
those nominated entities.
It's a possibility.
What else is on your electoral reform wish list?
Well, we can't forget about truth in political advertising.
Right.
We need strong legislation that prohibits misleading and deceptive claims in campaign advertising
Yeah?
with real consequences for those who break the rules.
Yes. It's not just about fairness between parties.
Exactly.
It's about protecting voters from being manipulated by misinformation.
Absolutely.
And,
Yeah.
thinking back to those Senate inquiry recommendations,
Right.
I remember they had some interesting ideas about strengthening the role of the Electoral Commission in overseeing all of this.
They did, giving the Electoral Commission more teeth with greater powers to investigate and enforce these rules
Yeah.
would be a crucial step in making these reforms truly effective.
It seems like there's a lot of good work that's already been done,
There is.
but it's been ignored in this rush to push through these flawed reforms.
It's frustrating, to say the least.
It is.
But it's not too late to change course.
Right.
We need to demand better from our elected officials.
Well, this has been a fascinating,
It has been.
albeit somewhat alarming,
Yeah.
deep dive into the proposed electoral reforms.
It's complex stuff.
It's clear that there's a lot at stake here,
There is.
and these changes have the potential to have a profound impact on the future of Australian democracy.
Absolutely. And it's up to all of us as engaged citizens
All right.
to make sure our voices are heard.
So to everyone listening,
Yes.
what stands out to you in all of this?
Yeah. What are your thoughts?
What are your biggest concerns?
Exactly.
What changes would you like to see?
Yeah.
We encourage you to do your own research.
Yes.
Delve into those Senate inquiry reports
Definitely.
and contact your local MP to share your thoughts. After all, a well-informed voter is a powerful voter.
It's our democracy.
Yes.
Let's make sure it works for everyone.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll be back next week with another deep dive into a topic that matters to you.
See you then.
Until then, stay curious, stay informed,
Yeah.
and most importantly,
Yeah.
stay engaged.